These trees in the New South Wales Riverina are helping one of the country's youngest horticulture industries to break through the billion-dollar barrier for the first time. An appetite for almonds at home and abroad has created a boom.
Australia is now one of the highest consumers of almonds per head in the world. We sell about a kilo per person it works out at in Australia. And now we've taken that success to the world. We ship to about 50 countries around the world.
About 80% of the world's almonds are grown in California, but Australia is fast sliding into second place. Tim Jackson from industry group The Almond Board says trade agreements with India and China have supercharged the opportunities.
The year before the FTA, we sold 300 tonnes into China. Before the season before this, when we had a good crop, we sold 50,000 tonnes. So we went from 300 tonnes to 50,000 tonnes in the space of about 6 years.
That demand typically offers higher returns for irrigators. So much so that growing nuts for the globe is rapidly changing the landscape here at home.
Back in the year 2000, there was roughly 3,500 hectares of almonds planted across Australia. Today, that figure is greater than 62,500 hectares, with orchards like this one spreading out across southern New South Wales, northern Victoria and parts of SA.
There's no real awareness about the almonds. We have come from nowhere in the last 20 years, to be fair.
What's the best thing you can do with an almond?
Eat it.
In the early 2000s, then rice grower Dennis Dinacola became one of the first to plant almond trees in the Riverina.
What did your neighbours think?
I was nuts. Yeah, they couldn't quite understand.
There was a key reason.
Why did I start to grow almonds? I started to grow almonds as soon as they told me there was going to be water deregulation. Being a rice farmer, that was probably a problem because some years you'd have all your allocation, some years you wouldn't. So, yeah, I decided that we needed to grow something where we get more, better return per megalitre of water, and that's when I sort of started looking at different crops, different permanent crops, and ended up deciding on almonds.
At the turn of the century, water entitlements that permit farmers to draw water from rivers and channels were separated from land titles, allowing for that water to be traded between farms.
I always think the simplest way to describe it is to think of two neighbours, each growing a crop. One thinks it's going to be a dry year and therefore holds back quite a lot of irrigation water to use. One thinks it's going to be a wet year and doesn't keep any irrigation water. Of course, the year ends up being somewhere in the middle, and so without water trading, you've got one farmer with excess water that he's got no use for, or she's got no use for, and the other farmer without enough water to finish the crop. By being able to trade the excess water from one farm to the other farm that hasn't got enough water, both end up with a good outcome. So if you then expand that to a writ large scenario across the basin or along a river valley, it highlights to you that being able to trade the availability of water results in a better economic outcome all round.
The process, known as unbundling, set Australia's water market in motion, and it now trades around $2 billion worth of water each year. A key component of the Murray Darling Basin plan, it's changed the way irrigators think and what they grow. Once, farmers would have grown crops based on returns per hectare, but the price and availability of water today means they're now chasing returns per megalitre. Around the same time Dennis Dinacola was changing the way he used water, the Acox family was rethinking its dairy enterprise at Rochester in northern Victoria.
As we headed through the millennial drought and that process of water being returned to the environment under the original Murray Darling Basin plan, that has led to a change in the way that we need to operate our farming business, primarily to produce forage and fodder for the cows to eat, but also change the way that we manage cows and the production system that we're left with today.
The family sold its permanent water entitlement to the Commonwealth, so that water would be left in the rivers to help the environment. The proceeds were then used to upgrade irrigation infrastructure and buy more land to produce feed for the cows.
But it's meant that now we have to participate in the temporary market every year in order to secure the water we need to produce the fodder for the cows. Ultimately, the unbundling has led to what we can see here with the cows being fed inside now. We don't graze cows anymore. We've shifted to a system that's more efficient to feed a cow, and that's why we have them housed in this type of system.
The herd of around 600 cows is now housed in a 6,000 square metre shed where they're fed 3 times a day. Instead of grazing pastures like you might expect on a typical Australian dairy farm, the land and water are used to produce forage crops, with around 80% of the cows' rations grown on farm.
So water does really form the basis for us to produce cheap and affordable forage to feed back to our cows to turn into milk. Ultimately, this is the outcome of returning water to the environment. Cows shift inside because we need to feed them more efficiently. We use a lot less water than we used to 20 years ago, and we grow a lot more feed. And we can still do that profitably.
With less water available for farming across the basin and the introduction of the water market, the value of water has soared. For many dairy farmers whose cows graze on pasture, they've been priced out of the irrigation market.
Went back to the start of unbundling. Across the Murray dairy region, we had 4,500 farms, or active dairy farms. We now have around 850. We're still producing, quite a lot of milk. I think we're over 1.2 billion litres of milk to come out of this region still, but that's off a lot less farms. So there is infrastructure out there that was put together over generations that has now idle. There's changes in production systems, and obviously, ultimately, when you take that number of active farms out of any region, it does have an impact on the social fabric of those communities.
Putting a roof over cows or switching to high-return crops like almonds are just 2 examples of how water policy is changing Australian farming. It's almost as though this huge change is occurring right before our eyes. And while farmers like Dennis and Tom are living it every day, few Australians might realise how significant the transformation is.
Water is moving to higher value returns. We've seen a significant expansion in the almond industry, and we've seen a significant expansion in the cotton industry, particularly in southern New South Wales. At the same time, there's been a flow of water out of the dairy sector, out of irrigated pasture, and to some extent out of the rice and horticulture sectors in the Riverina. And so that really shows the market working and that water being used for higher value purposes.
Mick Keogh is the Deputy Chair at the Australian Competition Consumer Commission. He says the water market is doing what it was designed to do.
I guess as the value of water per megalitre gets higher, that becomes more and more important because, of course, if your value of water is much higher than the value of the crop that you're producing, in many respects you're better off selling that water and getting better returns that way. And so that's how the market is working. And some people may criticise that and say it has an adverse impact on communities. That's true, but it also means that, for example, a retiring farmer can realise the value of their assets and retire and have succession occur, and a whole range of those sorts of things can happen. So there's pluses and minuses associated with the trade, but generally I think the overall impact is positive.
Since the first basin buybacks in 2009, more than 2,100 gigalitres of water has been allocated to the environment. Most of that water previously would have been used to grow food or cotton, but it now stays in the rivers. Last year, the Federal Parliament voted to ensure hundreds more gigalitres of water each year will build on that tally by the year 2027.
We have to make sure there's enough water, otherwise the rivers may run dry. If we don't act, it could threaten our plants and animals, our food supply.
As of today, there's a shortfall of around 750 gigalitres of water each year still to be returned to the environment. While some of that could come from infrastructure projects, the changes last year mean the Commonwealth can now enter the market and buy water entitlement from willing farmers. Expect that to put more pressure on those irrigators who remain to ensure every drop counts.
It's going to put a lot of pressure on those prices for that water, and it's only going to go one way, and that's up. And it's not going to be very pleasant, I don't think. A lot of people, you'd have to consider, letting part of your crops go. We'd probably even consider it like part of the orchard's getting a bit older. If we can't afford to buy water for it, we'll probably cut it off.
Yeah.
And you don't want to see that, and that's what's going to happen, because it's it'll get expensive because there's less water out there available to buy.
Almonds are one of the most water-intensive crops grown in the Murray Darling Basin. According to economist David Galliano, almond trees require 10 to 12 megalitres per hectare each year.
So the latest information we've got, the lower water users per hectare are more the pastures. They're around about that 3 megalitres per hectare. And then there's a whole lot of things in between. There's cotton is up around that 8 megalitres a hectare. Fruit and nuts is around about 7 or 8. And there's a few others in the middle there as well. Vegetables around 5. Yeah. Citrus is around about that 6 as well. But again, that varies between regions and seasons, and of course between individual farmers, soil type, and all that kind of stuff comes into it as well.
He says it's grower margins, not water use, that will determine how irrigation water is used.
If you take rice, for example, it's a much smaller margin commodity. So when you have, for example, a dry year and water allocation prices go up, there just aren't the margins there to be using allocation water on growing rice. So they'll tend to just sell their allocations to farmers downstream. And what we end up seeing is water just flowing to its highest value use. So it comes out of the more opportunistic crops, the cereals, the rice, livestock pastures, and it flows into the higher value fruits and nuts, those sorts of things.
The government's economists haven't figured out how buybacks might work in the Northern Basin, but say if 325 gigalitres of entitlement is purchased from the south, it would wipe more than $150 million from the value of farm production each year, with annual crops like rice most likely to be priced out of the water market. Their modelling also shows buybacks would have almost no impact on the value of almond production, raising questions about whether to expect an almond takeover in the Southern Basin.
It's an interesting question about where the limit of permanent plantations in the Southern Basin, whether we're there yet or not. I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did, but I don't know the answer to that question. My guess is there'll be some sort of a natural limit about how much almonds and fruit and nuts will be possible in the basin. So whether we're there yet or not, I don't know, but I can't see the entirety of the Southern Basin being all almonds, for example. I can't see that happening.
No one's telling anyone what to grow. People have gravitated to almonds because of the business case. And we certainly have no control over what people grow. Just like the water market demand is what drives what people plant and grow.
Trading water isn't like trading stocks on a spreadsheet. It relies on rainfall and rivers. If it doesn't rain, well, delivering water to where it needs to go becomes increasingly difficult. That's why having a diversity of farming, both annual and permanent crops, can help mitigate some of the fluctuations in water availability.
This week, the federal government will open a tender seeking the entitlements to 70 gigalitres of water from across the Southern Basin. That's less than 10% of the water that's still to be recovered for the environment in the next 3 years.
That's only going to lead to, more competition, and in particular these periods of extreme dry. What do we actually do when we don't have enough water to supply, the businesses already there? So that, to me, that's a worry. If we take more water out, where does that lead? Every sort of farming commodity across this region, it's a worry for all of us.